At this point, I think we've all had enough time since ExileCon to sit back and really think about some of the big announcements made over that weekend. If you weren't able to catch the streams or watch any of the summary videos yet, TLDR, Path of Exile 2 beta is coming next year. The game is a bit slower, seems a bit more mechanically difficult, improves some of the systems to be a bit easier to understand, and there's gold as a currency.
Hey yo, what the fuck?
Don't worry, apparently it's only used for small items during the campaign and may or may not have an effect on the endgame economy. I don't really know, I'm not here to talk about that today. What I am here to talk about is the fact that GGG has decided that Path of Exile 2 will not be an expansion to Path of Exile 1, but instead be a sequel, completely separate from the current game. This means that both Path of Exile 1 and 2 will be running simultaneously, both receiving continuous updates and content over the years, and each one having what seems like two different gameplay styles. That's right, your full-time job just doubled. Now you can lose yourself in both games and have twice the amount of grass you don't touch. So in this video I want to talk about the positives and negatives of this strategy, why I think GGG really didn't have a choice, and lastly, talk about some traps that I hope GGG doesn't fall into. Hopefully taking some lessons from the rest of the industry on splitting their player base for a classic and modern version of the same game. First, let me give some more detail on how this is supposed to work. The idea is that Path of Exile will continue to be Path of Exile, that is, in the way it is currently developed. We have seasons that drop every 3 months with a new seasonal mechanic, some will go core, some won't. You have the same campaign with the intricate web of an endgame that so many have praised or criticized. The development of the game will continue in the way that is consistent with the Path of Exile style, so that fans of the original will still have their game and not lose access to it once Path of Exile 2 comes out. So then Path of Exile 2 will be an entirely new game. A new campaign with updated skills and classes and ascendancies. While it looks to be similar in some ways, a lot of the gameplay style has changed. The movement and combat seems to be slower but more fluid. The animations are much more dramatic and emphasized. There are bosses with cool new mechanics during the campaign. And of course, a dodge roll button. I mean, come on, it's 2023, can you even call yourself a video game if you don't have a dodge roll button? Now you may be asking yourself, what if I want to play both? What happens if I love the current game but at least want to try out the new one? What if I want to start a new character to try out every mechanic in both games whenever there's a new season? Well, thankfully, GGG has the answer. They're going to stagger the start of new seasons. Today's seasons run about 3 months. Path of Exile just started one, the Trial of the Ancestors League. The next one can probably be expected sometime in December. In the future, Path of Exile 2 will also have 3-month seasonal cycles, but the start of these seasons will be somewhere in the middle of the Path of Exile 1 season. So basically, every 1.5 months, you'll have a new season to take part in. And this will continue until GGG or their players burn out from content overload. Okay, let's think positively first. What are some of the benefits that come from having 2 games instead of 1? Well, of course, the first and most obvious benefit is that you have twice as much content to enjoy. And depending on which style you like, you can choose to play one or the other. It's the best compromise between those players that want to play Path of Exile in the old way and those that want to try it in a new way. Do you like the current style of complicated mathematical and strategic build customization for lightning fast combat, where you will either dominate everything around you or be dominated by everything around you? Play Path of Exile 1 and enjoy yourself as you have been. Would you like to try a new, slower paced game with what seems like a bit more emphasis on the campaign and an evolution of the systems as you know them? Try Path of Exile 2. If you like both, well, you're in luck. You can try and play both and hope it doesn't take you longer than 1.5 months to play a season and move on to the next one. Probably the strongest benefit of the 2-game strategy is just the simple fact that players can choose which game they want to play. With how different Path of Exile 2 seems to be, I can't imagine that everyone would be happy to never play Path of Exile 1 again. To bring in a comparison here, I would say that it is very comparable to World of Warcraft and RuneScape. The reason their classic versions exist is because players didn't like how much the game had evolved over time, and they longed for the experience they used to have at the peak of their enjoyment. Path of Exile has a very similar problem. Over time, Path of Exile has grown to be a massive game, evolving over time and adding content every 3 months. It would be hard for GGG to make any major changes and not affect 300 billion different little computations of the game mechanics. Path of Exile 2 seems to be an answer for that. If the devs want to update the game, take it in a different direction altogether, the only way to do that without completely overhauling the main game seems to be to create an entirely new one and build your experience there. This is the same solution some folks have been asking for with World of Warcraft. The current version of World of Warcraft is huge. It has 20 years worth of content and updates for players to enjoy. Unfortunately, that means a lot of people coming in have no idea where to start, and even less have the dedication to make it to the latest expansion. Not to mention that the engine the game runs on could desperately use some updates. Anyway, some fans have stated that maybe the solution is to create a World of Warcraft 2. An entirely new game based on the same characters at maybe a different point in the World of Warcraft history. It seems that GGG has sort of put this idea into motion. They have taken their 10-year-old game, made sequel-worthy updates to the gameplay and mechanics, and are looking to start with a fresh new experience. This is probably the best thing you could do for a new player at this point, and I'm sure casual players are happy that they have a new opportunity to learn the game as it grows, instead of getting into it 6 years down the line and having 18 new mechanics to study. Granted, we don't know everything about PoE 2 yet. PoE 2 could just be as complicated as Path of Exile 1, but I guess we'll see when we get there. One last smaller benefit I want to call out is that having a second game that is smaller in size gives GGG the ability to be creative and try new things out. Like I mentioned before, one of the problems that larger, more established games have is that any change you make to the game, you have to make to the whole game. That means that every single mechanic needs to be balanced to now include the new one. So now that Path of Exile 2 is coming, if there is less content that needs to be balanced, that means that GGG gets more opportunities to make amazing seasonal content without having to balance anything from the 400 seasons that came before it. I'll be curious to see what kind of new content they can come up with. I wonder what type of mechanics they would introduce, or maybe little mini games like we've seen with Blight, the Sanctum, or with the Trial of the Ancestors now. But okay, are there any downsides to having two games? Well, having experienced both WoW Classic and old school RuneScape through its development and content updates, I definitely think that there are some lessons that GGG should take from these two games. One of the problems that WoW had when it was split into two games is that the player base was also split. Usually there are 3 groups of players when you split a game. There is one group on either side, and then you have one that tries their hardest to play both. So now you have 3 groups of players, and GGG is now competing against themselves for their players' attention. From a studio perspective, one game doing well is now pulling attention from the other. And I don't mean that people will just drop the game altogether, but it does mean that the amount of players in either game at any given time will vary based on what is going on with the other. For example, if Path of Exile 2 has a new season launching, I think it would be safe to say that there will be a population hit to Path of Exile 1 and vice versa. Not everyone will want to play both, but I think there will be a healthy amount of players who at least want to try both games at season launches. Season launches are fun, they're exciting for the community, and it makes you feel like you're part of something new and cool and big. So then what happens to the other game during that time? It will lose population, it will lose hype. The community won't be as engaged with it anymore, which means that the second half of the season will feel pretty lonely to play. Also, I know that hardcore players usually finish their season about 3 to 4 weeks in, or maybe less, but what about non-hardcore players? And I'm not necessarily talking about gamer dads with 2 hours a week to play. I'm talking about people like me, who play multiple games, who are still learning, I have a full-time job and YouTube taking up a lot of my time, and I still play video games more than a normal person. I don't know if they're going to be able to keep up with the seasonal grind. And you could say, well, go play standard. You don't have to worry about starting over every 3 months. And you're right. You could banish all lesser beings to the standard realm for not being able to complete their seasonal goals within half the normal season window. But really what you're telling everyone who can't keep up with this pace is that they can't take part in the big, sexy, important community events where everyone logs in at the same time, watches streamers figure out the new stuff, or even just enjoy the content when it's new and popular and not last month's news. This is similar to what happened in World of Warcraft between the classic and retail version of the game. Blizzard would stagger patches so new content in one game could be enjoyed before going to the other. It worked pretty well for most people, but patch cycles were usually 6 months or more, meaning that there was a healthy amount of time for even the casual raiders to enjoy and complete the latest raid. The only difference is that Path of Exile 1 and maybe Path of Exile 2, depending on how they build it, are highly complex games with more content and shorter seasonal cycles. Not only is there so much to do in the game, but the mechanics are much more complicated and require time and attention to complete. Not only that, but every 3 months you're starting from scratch, not just completing the latest content with the same powerful character. I personally think non-hardcore players are going to be split between games, and maybe that will work considering that non-hardcore players don't really feel the need to complete all the content in a single season. I just worry that cutting the season in half will create a much faster paced player base, trying to consume content and move on to the next big thing faster than they already do. It's like increasing the speed on your treadmill while you're running. Raise the speed enough or slow down, and eventually the treadmill will outpace the speed you can run, and when it does, you may not want to get back on the treadmill at all. The only other downside I can think of right now is dev resources and time. Not only will it be twice the amount of game for us to consume, but it will be twice the amount of game to develop. I understand they've been working on PoE 2 for however many years, and you can determine on your own if you feel that that's affected the quality of PoE 1, but I can tell you that GGG will have their hands full developing 2 fast-paced seasonal games with a player base that eats up content faster than can be put out. Even though it's natural for content to be consumed extremely quickly and player numbers to drop towards the end of seasons, I can't help but feel like GGG sped up their own timeline to develop their games. I really hope for both the studio and the players' sake that this pace can be kept up with, and neither group of people start to burn out too quickly. Now here's the last thing I'll bring up, and please tell me your opinion on this in the comments. I don't really think GGG had a choice but to break up the games into 2. Forget all of the positives and negatives I just talked about. GGG is at a point in PoE's development where soon, if not already, they will inevitably run into the same problem that every other live service game runs into. The game is just too big. I sort of mentioned this before in the video, but Path of Exile is a massive game with so many updates and content that has been added in over the years. It's sort of a massive achievement how well GGG has done keeping the game somewhat compact into a single cohesive experience that players are willing to restart every 3 months. But as someone who has just started playing 2 years ago, I saw how hard it was to look at the game and know what the fuck is going on. What do I start with? How does this skill work? Who's Einhar and why does he want me to capture and kill a bunch of exotic beasts? How do I build a viable endgame character and how do I navigate the endgame boss system? It's a lot. And of course, veterans and community engaged players have ways to deal with this. We have guides and wikis and content creators telling us what to do and when, even though honestly, it's still hard. And I think it would be more fun to learn the game without guides. The problem is with new or casual players, or just less hardcore players. Coming into the game and looking at all this content from afar is extremely daunting. And sometimes just the thought of what seems like an insurmountable task is enough to keep people from even trying. Even if you feel like you have a grasp on the game now, what happens if you were to stop playing for a year or 2 and come back? That's a lot of content you'd have to learn, on top of learning how it interacts with everything else in the game that was there before. What I'm trying to get at is that if GGG had continued with Path of Exile 1 and didn't try something to bring new or less hardcore players into the game, they would run into the same problem that all live service games that have been out for 10 years or more would run into: content overload. Want to play World of Warcraft? Okay, start at level 1 and make it through 19 years of content before you can get to the new stuff where the rest of the community is at. Want to play Final Fantasy XIV? Okay, well get ready to stick through 100 hours of story before you caught up to the latest expansion to take part in the latest raids and content that everyone is talking about. And I know I'm comparing this to a lot of MMORPGs, and that's not really what Path of Exile is, but I think that actually works in Path of Exile's favor. Path of Exile is in a sort of unique situation here. GGG doesn't have to worry about taking away a player's 20 years worth of progress by releasing a new game. As long as the in-game cosmetics can be shared between games, there is no reason for someone to feel like their progress has just been left behind. But that's kind of why I think GGG really didn't have a choice. If they wanted to make any substantial change to Path of Exile, breaking it up is the clear and best option. You don't have to worry about content overload because you can ease people into the community with a fresh new game. As long as you can develop the games side by side, you can give both types of players the Path of Exile they want. So not only are you solving some problems, but you're also ensuring the longevity of the IP by not forcing every player into one experience. In my opinion, this is the perfect middle ground between a live service style expansion and a normal non-live service sequel. Anyway, I'm more interested in what you all think. Let me know in the comments what you think about how GGG is handling PoE 1 and 2, or if you agree or disagree with what I mentioned in the video. But most importantly, I hope you enjoyed the video. Leave a like if you liked it and subscribe for more content. I hope you are enjoying the Trial of the Ancestors, and I can't wait to see what we talk about next.